Catus Maximus here. I'm going to make this a little bit shorter of a video about this Vevor 10-inch dual bevel compound miter saw. They did send this to me for free. It is a promotional product, and I appreciate getting the opportunity to try these out, and I appreciate the people who have been viewing my channel who ultimately gave me the opportunity. Although this is moderately affordable, $232, I guess. At the time of making this video, $232 shipped. There is some competition in this. There's a lot of competition on lower end compound miter saws these days, and in this dual bevel 10-inch, Skill came out with one that's pretty competitive. Harbor Freight has their Bauer, which is pretty competitive. I think what sets the Vevor apart is they decided to go with the side rail system, which is actually what Makita, I think, pioneered in the LS1019, maybe an earlier model. Makita also has other slide rails. The most common style is, instead of the saw sliding back and forth on fixed rails, instead the rails are attached to the saw's head, and then this bearing block is back here, and so the rods are sliding back and forth. It makes it a lot easier to deal with. You don't have these rods on the side which interfere with the fence and being able to get full bevel angles without having to remove the fences. But they have one Achilles heel, and that is when the rods are what's moving back and forth with the head. When you have the saw all the way back, the rods stick out more than a foot out of the back of the saw. And even though it keeps them out of the way is ultimately a better design, that one issue where the rods stick out, make this saw an option to where if you don't have a lot of shop space and the saw can't be spaced out from the wall, where it's got to be really close to the wall, this is obviously a solution because you don't have rods sticking out. If you're actually carrying this around, taking it to job sites, etc., maybe you're into building maintenance, that type of thing, which would be or an entry-level carpenter, that's who would buy a cheaper saw. This is something that will either use occasionally and then you save some money because you just don't need a $600 Bosch or a Makita or something like that, or even like a $400 rigid. So either save some money because you're an occasional user, or this saw will more than pay itself off and pay off a much more expensive one, which is kind of the idea. And at least it does have a shadow line. One of the nice things about shadow line, here we are. Everybody always has to show the shadow line. It's pretty well defined here because they have a pretty bright LED, as you can see. And actually I like that. Periodically you're going to have to open the guard up and wipe out the LED so it stays relatively clean. But it doubles as a table work light too. And you can just leave the LED on the whole time. It's not like laser. You might be worried about getting glints of laser in your eye or something like that, although most saws are pretty good about it. The shadow line is undeniable because it just happens to show exactly where the blade itself is going. And it's kind of super nice just to have a general work light to boot. And you leave it on so as soon as you plug in the saw, the light turns on so you know that you have power. If a circuit breaker blew or maybe something else, you'll know because the light will be on or off. And I'm starting out with the good before I do have. The criticisms about this saw, I think it's good value. I don't have experience with the Harbor Freight Bauer or the Skill. Those are the two that I found that were really like the $250 price range sliding 10-inch dual bevel saws. And the dual bevel, loosen this up here, we do have a stop. So most saws, when you're bevel, like single bevel, it's always to counterclockwise. So any saw that does a double bevel, the second beveling is always clockwise or to the right. And so it actually has a pull-out stop so you can bevel to the right. Now, with the fences in these normal positions, it's only about 20 degrees of bevel. These fences have these little clips and they kind of slide out some like this. And what's annoying is that only allows you to do 30 degrees of bevel. You actually have to take and really loosen this screw all the way up. And the issue is, we have the fence, I got it a little bit too loose there. It has a stop when you loosen it, but we can see this really gets you in trouble here. is this. I'm already touching the bars. You're looking at about 35 degrees, and it gets you into trouble because you're going to forget about this. Maybe you'll just slide that over, and then you'll come swinging this down to do maybe a 45-degree cut and forget that you have to remove the fence, and it's asking for trouble dinging up these rods. These rods absolutely will not take getting dinged up. I put a little bit of, you just put a light oil to something, transmission fluid, motor oil. Just don't put heavy grease. It needs to be a pretty thin oil. They do have felt seals in there, but these rods, I mean, the Achilles heel to any sliding saw, that's one of the reasons they Rigid and Bosch and stuff have the knuckle, folding knuckle designs, is because of the delicacy of these rods. If they get dented, they won't slide past those dents, and there's no way to repair it. These things are ground. In this case, since it's a Chinese-made product, those are 25 millimeter. And the second issue is them getting rusted. So periodically wipe them down and give them oil. But you got to remember, it's just really unfortunate how they didn't design these fences to be able for it to do the full 45-degree bevels. And the motor, even though it has one of the up-angled motors, you still have to remove the fence on this side. So you go forward, and there's actually a little notch here so it can pop out. And now we can go all the way over to our 45 degrees. They do pretty set up the stops. I mean, I guess there's been enough complaints where they spend that a little bit of effort. As far as I can tell, it comes from the factory pretty darn square. With these rear fences, it's always, you got a couple screws on each side, you loosen them, and then you just use some type of square to make sure it's square that way. It does have adjustable stops for the bevels, although they're really tiny. Other saws will use bolts with wide bolt heads, so they have a little bit more surface area. Those stops work good, but as you use it, they'll kind of bite in to the aluminum, so you're going to periodically have to check those. Before I forget, it does have an adjustable depth stop if you just want to try to use this to make dados, slots in wood, or simply not cut all the way through something. That's a nice feature. I wanted to show, there is probably 3/4 of an inch of clearance. Speaking of clearance, surprisingly enough, using this hypoid system, they have a pretty compact gearbox. And if we take a look-see here, it is 3 7/8 inches. So it's almost 4 inches. This will nearly do a cut of a rough finished 4x4. Of course, wood that's been planed or finished like this is always a 1/4 inch aside. These are called 2x4s, even though they're 1.5 by 3.5. A 4x4 is a 3.5 by 3.5. A rough sawn has a really rough surface. That's the lumber that's nominally sized, and this will almost but not quite do it. They did offer me the 12-inch, but like so many other people, 12s are just huge, heavy, expensive, with expensive blades. Even the Vevor, it's another $100. It's like $350 for their 12-inch, and they actually, they offered to send that one, and I actually went with the 10-inch because that's all my other miter saws are 10s, and I have a lot of 10-inch blades. And the big advantage of the 12-inch saws is that is the thickness of the material. About the same length of cut. This is going to give you about 12 inches of length. This will cut a 6x12 or a 4x12 for that matter. Where a 12-inch saw, actually I don't know if the 12-inch saw quite has 5.5 inches. Something to do with the larger gears and stuff, dealing with, I don't know if it's the gears or what, but it's the millimeters, 255 versus 305. But interestingly enough, we have a 12 by 3.5 inch. It's advertising 3.5 in the book, even though it's actually 3 7/8, as we saw from the very lowest point of the motor housing. I don't know why they wouldn't at least advertise 3 3/4 there. But only going from their specified 3.5 to 4 1/8. So maybe it's a little bit more as well on the 12-inch, but you don't get much extra depth of cut, and the length of cut only gets 1 3/8 versus, or it's 13 3/8 versus 12 on the 10-inch saw. So there just wasn't that much of a difference. only if you really need it. The other thing that I thought was odd was this, that both saws, so either they're incorrect about the 12-inch saw being 5,000 RPM, because I couldn't believe that the 10-inch saw, I mean, 5,000 is about the standard speed for 10-inch saw, and 12-inch saws run a bit slower, like 4,800, 4,600, something like that. But if a 12-inch saw is running at the same RPM with the same 15-amp motor, it's simply going to have less torque, less power than the smaller blade geared the same. So a little puzzling there. So a lot of the arguments, unless you absolutely need the size of the 12, just get the 10 for all those reasons. Plus 10-inch saws offer a bit more rigidity. As with any, and I don't have much experience with sliding saws at all, much less dual bevel. But I do know, at least from old school work with radial arm saws, you just want to be careful. Some people complain about slight tapers. When you see them cut, they're like kind of manhandling the handle, grabbing it and pushing it off to the side. And that actually isn't bad. Take any sliding miter saw and push it back and forth, and you're going to get some wobble in the blade. So when you do your cuts, you just kind of make sure that you're pushing absolutely straight forward. And just pay attention and try not to push, from side to side, and that will help with cut accuracy. You use a table saw with a slide with a, miter slide thing. I don't know what they're called. If you want really accurate cuts. We do have a couple of built-in extensions for material holding. They work fine. I guess we'll do one little cut here just to see how this goes. Whoop. You do get a little bit more rigidity out of the blade. I will say too, at least when it's new, it slides pretty well, especially freshly oiled. But I was going to attempt to show this. They must be using some wave washers in there, but they've pre-tensioned this spring or the spindle because it's actually pretty tight. So I'll give them credit for that too, even though it's a cheap saw. Using the clamp, almost never use these, but since I'm trying to hold the phone here, I mean, it has a tolerable break. I mean, that's about as good as you can expect from any. Brakes actually tend to get a little better as a tool breaks in. Brushes have a little bit better contact. I mean, how the brakes work is it's an extra field winding in the motor. And when you release the trigger, they have special triggers which actually have switches both in the on and the off position. The off position reroutes the brushes through that brake winding and basically causes the motor to reverse on itself until enough voltage drops from the loss of the wire and the brushes. Generally want to use ear protection. These things are, doing a small cut like that, okay. If you're doing a bunch of cuts, it's noisy. Saws are loud. Dust collection, I mean, unless it's like a Festool miter saw or like the Makitas. The Makita has one of the best of dust gathering, but saws throw chips everywhere. And ones that have this top exit aren't particularly great. So, hooking up a vacuum will help reduce sawdust, but that's about it. Anyway, figured we ought to... I didn't press all the way down on the previous cut, but, just out of the box, I mean, if you just, use a reasonable amount of pressure, it's actually pretty darn square. It's obvious that they did adjust it. But besides all that, once again, I have to compare it to the other brands. It's just the selling point of this saw, surprisingly enough, even though it's inconvenient, is the side rail. Just simply because it doesn't stick out the back of the saw. A lot easier to carry around, a lot easier to use if you have highly limited space and it has to be next to the wall. Even though you still have to have, be able to reach that lock knob. Nicer ones have systems where you can adjust the bevel up here. It does have a little footy here. Most of them do, so it doesn't want to tilt forward. But you do have to be careful of these little fleeties because when you're carrying it, the weight tends to be towards the front. You know, you turn it to the side. Really easy to bend this thing, but at least it does have the little footing. The bevel gauge is probably one of the worst parts. Anyway, the miter gauge, the bevel gauge, hard to read, really fine markings, and they put it vertically rather than something where you know, where you could look down this way or maybe just look off to the side. Hard to read. Probably the worst part. Well, that and having to just totally remove the fence if you want to do a 45-degree bevel. I don't know if that's something that's more... I assume that's a difference with other saws. You know, with compound miter saws like the Hitachi and stuff, they have a flip fence. And maybe they could have integrated something like that here, some flip fences. I mean, they are thin, but, you know, what do you expect? It's a $250 saw. I will at least give them credit for having a pretty thick casting down here. It's obvious that they did at least put some thought into it. Lots of heavy-duty webbing all throughout this, so it's pretty rigid. At least it's, you know, a decent casting. I mean, for $250, I mean, there's a heck of a lot of machine work, molding. I mean, all sorts of aluminum molds, plastic molds, machine work, finishing, ground rods. You're actually getting quite a bit for $250. I will point out, it will do 50 degrees left and right, but what's hilarious about it is that their scale goes beyond 50 degrees for absolutely no reason. Although I will give them credit, a lot of machines, they just use like a plastic red arrow that points. Kind of like the clear thing with the red line. It's actually because it keeps the line really close to the black tick marks. And actually, at least that's pretty easy to read. Common stops at 15, 22.5, 31.6, and 45. It does have some rubber feeties to keep it sliding around, but, you know, if you take this around the job sites, eventually these things will pop out and you'll have to remove all of them. But, you know, at least they tried. They do have screws to prevent these supports from sliding out. You know, no used miter saw I've ever bought has ever had these. People just, I guess, hate them, or they don't come pre-installed. Casting here, it's fine, but it's definitely not the thickest. It's not a Milwaukee or a Makita. But what those saws have a little bit different of a design, where this table is supported more inboard, so they need a little bit heavier duty webbing to make sure they stay stable. This does like what I just reviewed a Hitachi, which I sold. There's a little metal shim, but the table rides on this outer lip, so it is further out. It does have more stability, but there's an Achilles heel, like I was talking about the Hitachi, because the sliding surface is right here on the edge. As wood chips and stuff build up, tiny little bits of sap and stuff eventually find their way into that little crevice, because it's just directly exposed. All the sawdust that's building up is right against that sliding surface, and eventually they start getting sticky, and you'll be forced to remove the base in order to clean it up. Once again, Makitas, Milwaukees, the table stick, that sliding surface is more inboard. It's much better protected and just gets gummed up a whole heck of a lot less. As we saw on the bottom of this here, and more so as we get inboard, we have a lot of big gaps there, which I do like. That helps prevent sawdust and stuff, and little bits of wood from clogging up that blade tray too much. So that's my review of this saw. I'll have a link down in the description. The only thing that's also odd is it's almost like there's an extended table that since these are made by Chinese contract manufacturers, there must have been some model which had, you know, not these kind of extensions, but like a nice slot-in type table extender, or, you know, some kind of stop. The manual doesn't even describe why those notches are there. Otherwise, that's my detailed video about this Vevor saw. Not many reviews of this up on YouTube. I don't know how many people are accepting them. There's actually a couple natural reviews of people who bought it, and I think, you know, they did okay. But these specific saws, dual bevel sliding 10-inch saws in the $250 price segment, is competitive, and so you just have to kind of evaluate it. And probably for the third of the last time, the selling point of this one is that they copied this Makita side rail system. Once again, Makita has both kinds of rail systems, but this thing for portability and using in tight spaces. I mean, its overall depth from the end of the lock knob for the bevel to the very tip of this is 31 inches, where it can be 40 inches for the other styles of the rods stick out the back. They are just absolutely massive saws. So this has compactness and portability for the sacrifice of something in your way. It's just something's got to give, and that's why those knuckle systems exist, because they give you the best of both worlds. A sliding, or instead of sliding, I mean, they are a linear motion while being compact. But those systems are only on expensive saws right now. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.